Darkness kills, destroys the will. Find a spark, make hearts thrill. Hear the tales of time so grim. Shine a light, don't let it dim. Heather Brown downtown, bound. True crime story she's found. In the shadows, secret stay. Need a light that finds the way.
All right, we're back again for the second part of the serial killers Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano with Detective Julissa Trapp, who is just a badass detective. And if you didn't listen to the first part, stop the tape and go back and listen to the first segment where she tells you the beginning and the middle of the story of the serial killers that were working in Anaheim to kidnap, rape, and murder 5 young girls. So we're back, and we were talking about how you were investigating the murder of Jure Estep, who was a young girl who was found on a conveyor belt at the trash, what do they call it, depository? What do they call it?
It's called our trash recycling center, but yes, it's a trash processing center in the city of Anaheim.
The trash processing center. Her body comes up. You discover who she is through the tattoo on her neck. You get some cell phone records that lead you to her last known location, which was a hotel off of Beach Boulevard.
That's correct, yeah.
In the city of Anaheim. You hunt down one John Lead, and he turns out to be a nothing burger because he doesn't seem like he's lying. You find out her pimp has an alibi. You still don't know who murdered her. You're following up the leads on the trash. And coincidentally, but we learn not coincidentally, there's 3 women who have been reported missing from their family members that are also working as prostitutes who, starting in October, started disappearing. And now there's a big break in the case. Tell us about that big break.
So there was 2 things that kind of happened simultaneously. One of the things was that my partner, Detective Lilimone at the time, saw me very frustrated. And he's like, hey, Julissa, did you ever think about running parolees that were GPS monitors just to see if any of them were on the boulevard at the same time as Jure? And I remember at the time laughing it off, thinking, do you know how many parolees are going to be on Beach Boulevard?
A ton.
Like, that's not going to narrow my leads. And I said, okay, yeah, I'll keep it in the back of my mind. And we were working the trash that we had collected, and a report had been left on my desk that there had been a print hit on a caulking tube that had been found by Bruce Lynn, and it had been collected pretty close to Jure's body. And so I'm like, okay, well, who's this guy? Who does print belong to? Turns out it belonged to a guy who worked as a window installer in the east end of Anaheim at a window location. And it was off of La Palma and Cosby Way. And so I called him up and I said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about something. Do you mind meeting me somewhere? And he's like, well, I get off of work at 5. Can we just talk at my house? And I said, absolutely. So we go to his house and I show up and I have a picture of the caulking tube. And I said, hey, I understand you work as a window installer. And he's like, yes. And I said, does this look familiar? And he goes, yes, that's the kind of caulking that we use to install windows. I said, okay, wonderful. Can you tell me where you discarded this one? And it was almost laughable, right? Because he's like, I go through like 100 of these a day. And so,
now at this point, you're not thinking he's necessarily the suspect, are you?
No. What I'm thinking is, if I can figure out where this caulking tube came from, maybe I'll find my crime scene. Maybe I'll find the trash dumpster that Jure had been placed in that ultimately ended her up at the recycling center.
And then maybe some video or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay,
so
go on.
He's looking at me like I'm crazy. And then it was almost like a light bulb went off. He goes, oh, actually, I can tell you where I threw it away. And I said, you can? And he's like, yes. We have a company policy. We do not throw away trash at a customer's home. All the trash comes back to our business location. Great. Where's your business? La Palma and Cosby Way. And I said, okay. And I said, does your business have cameras? He goes, oh, yeah, we have a great camera system. Wonderful. Let me see if I can go over there. He goes, oh, they're closed. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, maybe I can go tomorrow. And so that's how we parted way. The plan is for Bruce Lynn and I to go to the business the next morning to get cameras. And that's exactly what we did. So it's day 14.
Now, yeah, I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
So it's day 14 since
Yes.
you have found, since Jure's gone missing or since you found her body?
And I take it back. It's day 15.
Okay.
Because we went to talk to him on day 14. And yes, it's 2 weeks since we have found Jure.
Okay.
And so we go to the business. We meet with the manager who's very helpful. He says, yes, I have great cameras. And as we pull to the business, we see a blue trash dumpster. And by this time, Bruce Lynn and I are so used to sticking our heads in trash cans that he says, I'll go to the trash. You talk to the manager. I said, awesome. So I go inside and he shows me his system. It's wonderful. It's HD, multiple cameras everywhere. And I'm like, great. I need this date. And he's like, okay, what date are you looking at? And he's like, okay. He's like, oh, yeah, we're on a 14-day loop.
Oh.
And I'm like, what do you mean you're on a 14-day loop? He goes, yeah, it disappeared yesterday. And my heart sunk. And as I'm talking to him, realizing I'm a day too late, my phone is going off and it's Bruce Lynn. And I'm like, what do you want? I finally answer it. And he's like, Jules, you need to come back here. And I'm like, what? He goes, you need to come back here. And I'm like, okay. So I go to the alley and I see the blue dumpster. And in this dumpster, I see this blue wrapped tarp. And it was the same tarp that I had seen wrapped around Jure. And I stick my head in the trash can and I could see that all the trash looks so similar to all the trash that I'd seen on the conveyor belt. And I knew at that moment, this is it. This is the dumpster she was placed in. I'm at the right place. And I was like, okay, we need to do a frantic canvas of this area. Like, this is it. And I said, hey, why didn't we check this area before? And Bruce is like, I don't know. So I called JD and I said, hey, how come we haven't checked this area? I don't recognize it as one of the routes that the trash company had given us. He goes, I don't know. And so I'm frustrated. And Bruce Lynn looks at me and he knows exactly what I want. Because by this time, we've been working together for so long. He knows exactly what I'm thinking. And he's like, yeah, I know what you're thinking. I'll call the trash company. And so he calls and he gives them the address. And, kudos to the trash company. They were like, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. We forgot to give you that route. Yes, we picked up trash that morning. And so at that moment, we knew we were exactly at the place that Jure had been discarded. And as we're heading back to the station to get more flyers, because now we're going to do this frantic search, I end up actually seeing a male at the business next door. Nondescript, average, male, late 30s, early 40s. And he's just kind of looking at us. And I thought, okay. And as we're heading back to the business or to the barn, our station, my sergeant calls me and he's like, hey, the sex crimes unit called and said, hey, did you think about running parolees with GPS monitors? And I told my sergeant at the time, I'm like, you know what? Lillimon mentioned that. And I go, initially I brushed it off because all we had was Beach Boulevard. But now that we know that this is most likely where she was discarded, it's 15 miles away, two completely different areas. Beach Boulevard at the time, ridden with crime, to a industrial business complex in the east end of Anaheim where everything shuts down. I'm like, now we have two locations that we can check. At the time, I really didn't think anything was going to come of it. It was more like a check the box. Let me get through that door so I can close it. Mm-hmm. And so I called one of the sex crimes detective that was the only one that had access to the system. And I gave the detective the coordinates and I said, hey, can you check any parolees that were on Beach Boulevard at like around 7 p.m. on March 13th, and anybody that would have been in that same 24-hour period at this location in East Anaheim. Gave the information and continued with my day to try to do my frantic canvas at this new location. And that was that. Went home that day. The next morning, I was like, oh, I never heard the outcome to this search. And in my head, I'm thinking, well, nothing must have come of it, right? Or else I would have heard. So I called the detective back and I said, hey, because I just want to check it off my notebook. It's been done. Did you find anything on this search? And the detective's like, oh my gosh, yes. And I said, what do you mean, oh my gosh, yes? And they're like, there's one person. Who? She's all Frank Cano. He's a sex registrant in our city. He was on Beach Boulevard at the time that Jure went missing, and he was on Cosby Way, around the trash dumpster that we had just located. And my heart just sunk. And I was like, wait, a parolee wearing a GPS monitor is on Beach Boulevard, and he's like, what are the odds?
Slim to none.
And from there, we had a lead. And I had been working with the Santa Ana detective at the time, Detective Gus Morioki,
Oh, I love Gus.
Yes, who doesn't, right?
Doesn't he have a daughter who's like now in law enforcement, maybe?
I don't know, but
think so.
I just know that he is, yes. And so I call him and I said, hey, you're not going to believe this. We have a lead. And he's like, what? I said, yes. A parolee, sex registrant. He was at the same place that Jure went missing, and he's at the place that we now know Jure was discarded. And I said, I know that you guys have phone records from Kiana, Josephine, and Martha. I would like you to bring those records over because I would like my partner, Bruce Lynn, to map exactly where they disappeared and see if Frank Cano was there. So he says, okay, I'll be right over. And again, long shot, right? Like, what are the odds? So he brings him over. We asked this detective, hey, can you come over, bring your computer? Because we want to compare these locations. And they end up coming over, and Bruce Lynn, methodically, one by one, Kiana Jackson, maps out the place that she had last, when her phone went dead, maps Frank Cano. The detective pulls it up on her computer, exact same spot. They do the same thing with Josephine Vargas. It's a match. And the same thing with Martha. And it's a match. And I just remember looking at Bruce Lynn and staring at the computer and like not believing it and thinking, holy shit.
Holy shit.
We have a serial killer.
We got a serial killer.
And I started doing workup on Frank Cano and end up finding out from his parole agent that he's got a buddy that he's very close with. And so close that they've actually gone on the lam twice, where they've cut their ankle monitors off and gone to a different state. And I said, who's that? And she tells me, Stephen Gordon. And I said, is he still on parole? And he's like, no, he just discharged. And he's now under federal probation, back on a monitor. And so I ended up finding out, okay, well, was he on a monitor for Kiana, Josephine, and Martha? And she's like, well, he was on a monitor when Kiana went missing and when Josephine went missing. Okay, can we go back and run him? She's like, yes. So run him, end up finding out that Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano were together.
Both of them together, and their cell phone records and
their GPS
their GPS monitoring show that they were in the same location
at the time that Kiana went missing and the time that Josephine went missing.
What about Jure?
So for Jure, for Stephen Gordon, it was probation. His probation monitor put him there.
Got you. And
for Frank Cano, it was his parole monitor. The only one that did not have any GPS was for Martha. It was a match for Frank Cano because he was continuously wearing the monitor the whole way through. But for Stephen Gordon, they had taken the monitor off on November 10th, and they had reinstalled it November 13th. So there was this 3-day period where he didn't have a monitor. It just happened to be when Martha went missing. So we had no GPS tracks for Stephen Gordon for when Martha went missing. But for Frank Cano, we had him on all 4 women.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was at that time that we learned it's not only are they all related, not only is it a serial killer, it's 2.
Yeah. That's crazy.
2 registered sex offenders.
Serial killers.
Wearing GPS monitors.
While they're kidnapping and murdering young girls. Did you just get the chills when that realization came through? Oh my God.
It was overwhelming because not only, okay, yes, this thing just got a lot bigger. But in my head, I'm thinking, how many more? Because I started to have their GPS tracks ran for every day. And I started realizing that they were going to the boulevard 2 or 3 times a week.
Oh my God.
So is there more? Is there more women that are missing? More women that I don't know about? We ultimately learned that they would hunt for women the day before trash pickup. So the day before the trash was to be picked up to the location where Stephen Gordon worked, which was right next to the window install place. That's when they would go look for victims, and they would bring them back to this auto body shop, and they would not only kidnap them, but rape them. Both of them, first one, then the other. And then I think the cruelest thing they did is...
So for the record, Stephen Gordon, because I know he hates this, is a rapist.
He is.
And a murderer.
He is.
And that's not going to make him very happy, but I don't care. I know you have to be Detective Trapp with him, but I don't. So I'll say it.
Yeah, I think the cruelest thing that they did to these women is that after they had not only kidnapped and raped them in the most horrific way, because I have the images of Jure at the autopsy. I saw the bruising on her thighs. So I know that her last minutes on Earth were not pleasant. And I know that it is definitely not consensual. But the cruelest thing they did is that after they were done sexually assaulting them, is they led them all to believe that they were going to get to go home. And they would let them get dressed, let them think that they were leaving, and then they would put them in a car. And these women are thinking that they're going to get dropped back off, and then they would start to strangle them. And one of them would strangle them as the other one would kick them or punch them in the stomach to get the air out faster. And once they were dead, then they would take them back to the auto body shop, strip them of all their clothing and all their personal belongings, ultimately remove all their identity, put them in a trash bag, and throw them away like trash. After they would clean them to get rid of any DNA evidence. And, you know, they almost got away with it.
But we found DNA evidence.
We did. Because they did not know that Jure was on her period. And Jure had a tampon. And during the autopsy, where a tampon should not be, so you could tell how forceful the sexual assault is, they removed a tampon. And out of that tampon, there was 2 male profiles. And those profiles belonged to...
Guess who?
Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And I remember one of them bit her on the arm.
Yes. You know, I've had to interview both of them. I've sat down with both of them, and you know, I don't entirely believe everything that each one of them has told me.
Yeah, nor should you, because they're full of shit. But
I to this day I don't know which one bit her. One of them did.
She had bite marks on her arm, though.
She did. They all fought like hell.
And we're going to get to those interviews. So at this point, you have 4 victims. We know that these 2 guys kidnapping, raping, murdered these 4 women. And when you initially arrested them, right? So there was a little drama with the arrest, right? Tell us about that. So now, did you guys go? I know. I got to ask you though, because I know I did read the case since it was mine. But I know that there was a little bit of a lag time, because it was like, how do we, arrest them? Do we wait on them? Do we sit on them? What if they murder someone else and elude us? So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we actually did a surveillance on them for 10 days to try to gather more evidence. And during those 10 days, we were.
I just need to back up. So when you're doing this, I know you're saying gather more evidence, and people who are listening are probably thinking, you got their DNA, but at the time, like, this crime lab does not work that quickly. So you didn't know at the time that you had this DNA evidence.
No. And one of the things that we were trying to do is, even though that they've committed crimes and their DNA is in the database, it takes a long time. And that's what the public doesn't know. For us to upload DNA and then get what we call it a CODIS hit, that takes time. It's much quicker if we can get a fresh sample, bring it to the lab and say, okay. And so part of the surveillance team's mission was to try to get these guys to discard something. And they did.
Other than people in the trash can.
Yes. Frank Cano threw away a piece of gum. And so we were able to grab that piece of gum, take it to the crime lab. And, kudos to the crime lab, because they knew how desperate I was. They actually worked 24 hours a day on this case, and they were able to get me a DNA hit back pretty quickly once we collected the gum. So all of this is happening simultaneously as we're following them. And, the big controversy was like, what about if they pick up a girl? what are we going to do? How long are you going to let it go? And obviously, you know, preservation of life is our number one priority, but that was the very 10 stressful days of my life. I think I lost 30 years of my life during those 10 days.
Yeah.
But I had the FBI helping me, Jeff Cunio, who helped me talk to the BA unit, behavior analysis unit. And I talked to a guy from Quantico that helped kind of profile them and gave me some interview strategies once I arrested them. And the whole goal was to arrest them together and for me to basically bounce back and forth interviewing them. And I got to give kudos to them. One of the things he told me, he's like, they're going to have some kind of intimate relationship. And I'm like, what do you mean intimate relationship? He's like, yeah, think of it like a domestic violence relationship. What I didn't know, and you know, spoiler alert, is that they were lovers. So which made the story even more bizarre. So here were two men, registered sex offenders. And when I say registered sex offenders, child molesters.
One was a boy and one was a girl, right?
Correct. Actually, no. Yes. One girl, one boy.
Of that, I mean the victims,
Correct.
the children that they had sexually assaulted.
Yes. So you've got sex offenders that are molesting children that now have a romantic relationship with each other.
And they're raping and murdering female prostitutes.
Correct.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, I could imagine, including us.
Yes. So when it came time to
typical.
make no, not typical at all. Which, you know, is what's unique about this case and them, I guess.
Well, you know, I think what it doesn't go, I mean, what am I trying to say? I think if you look at it, right, like you got to be involved in a very intimate relationship with someone to commit such horrific crimes with another person and like trust them enough to not to rat you out or right. But then they both have something on each other. So yeah, there's got to be something super dark and twisted and intimate that's going on between the two of them.
And I actually didn't know about their intimate relationship until the day before I arrested them, because we had written a search warrant for their cell phones. And at the time, we got text message content. And so it's the day before the arrest, and the cell phone companies provide these text messages. And then all of a sudden, we start reading these text messages. And we're like...
It's clear they're lovers.
Clear that they're lovers. And so... I really didn't know where I was going to go in the interview with these guys, because I'm like, wait a minute. Child molesters, they're having sex with each other, but they're raping women. Where do I even start with these guys? So it was a long evening trying for me to decide what theme I was going to choose when I walked into these interview rooms with them.
And let's not forget, you've had barely any sleep. You're under tremendous amounts of stress and pressure. And I'm assuming there's a whole bunch of people watching you to make, to see how you do it, right? You got to perform. Now's the time. The pressure was grand. I can only imagine.
It was tremendous. Yes.
Yeah.
When it finally came time to interview Stephen Gordon, I think at one point I walked out of the interview room for a break and there was like 15 people crowded around a TV watching what I was doing. So, yes, the pressure was, surreal at the time.
Wow. That's crazy. Okay, so you go in and Cano lawyers up.
So, we ended up arresting Frank Cano, bring him in, and I actually ended up talking to him for about 45 minutes.
Oh.
Yeah, so we talked for a little bit, but as I transitioned into trying to get information from him, he's actually very polite about it. He's like, hey, no disrespect. You said Julie's your name? Yeah, I can't talk to you. And I said, okay, fair enough. So I take him downstairs into the jail, and when I come back up, I see my partner Bruce Lynn, and he's on the phone, on the cell phone. I'm like, what are you doing? And I look down and I realize he's got Frank Cano's phone. And I'm like, who are you texting? And he's like, Stephen Gordon. I'm like, what do you mean you're texting Stephen Gordon? And at the time, we had learned that they had a code. Like they would ask each other secret questions to make sure that their phone hadn't been compromised. And so Stephen Gordon was quizzing Bruce Lynn to see if he knew the answers. And kudos to Bruce Lynn. He got like 2 of them right. And then another question came and it didn't go so well. And Steve Gordon has some colorful words for us. And we ended up finding out.
So he knew the cops got his phone.
Yeah.
And that he's been busted because he wasn't present when you arrested Cano, right? He was at work.
And
Stephen Gordon was at work.
Stephen Gordon was at work.
And you arrested Frank Cano as he got on a bus?
He was getting on a bus. We think he was going to flee.
Yeah. And they were texting, and it seemed like they were maybe going to flee.
Absolutely.
And then at some point, you go and arrest Stephen Gordon?
Yes.
Was that without incident?
No. So Stephen had kind of barricaded himself in his business, and I was negotiating with him on the phone.
Oh my God. Now you're like a negotiator on the phone.
And as I'm negotiating his surrender, he decides to make a run for it. And our crime task force, which they're phenomenal hunters, see him, and he's on a bike, and he's making a break for it. And, they
bike versus the whole entire police department and the
yes,
FBI.
Yeah. So somehow, I don't know what happened. He hit a rock or something. I don't know. He goes flying over the handlebars.
Something hit his
lands in the middle of the
Something hit his
street.
his bicycle tire.
Yeah. So flying over the handlebars, lands in the middle of the street, and he needs to go to the hospital. So I'm like, shit. Okay. Well, there goes that interview. And I was afraid that something was going to be broken and I wasn't going to be able to bring him back. But luckily,
he was fine.
Soft tissue damage.
Yeah, and, He was fine.
Gave me an opportunity to go home, get a couple hours of rest before my little conversation with him that lasted 13 hours.
13-hour interview with the serial killer, Stephen Gordon. Okay, so tell us about that.
I approached it like I do anything, right? I knew I needed to become his best friend. And I needed him to trust me in order for him to have, ultimately the trust to tell me what he had done. So
let's be honest, he developed a little crush on you, right?
I don't know if, I don't think so. I think he has I think he respects me. And I think that he is grateful that I treated him like a human. Right. I was kind. I showed him respect, and I was willing to listen to his story. So,
well, and everyone is deserving of that. As much as I hate the evil deeds that he and Frank Cano committed together, I'm confident that there's something in his past.
Yeah, I think so too.
That it doesn't excuse it, doesn't justify it, doesn't mean you don't sit and rot in prison for the rest of your life, but I don't think people just automatically wake up to be serial killers. They are influenced. No. They've been traumatized. There's something that they've seen, heard, learned, done that just or opened their souls up to the devil, and the devil got in. I'm confident the devil got into him. So,
yeah, I don't know if I would call it a crush. I think there's maybe some admiration that maybe I was a worthy adversary for him. I don't know. I know that Judge Yellen, who was just Larry Yellen to me back then, at one point looked at me during this whole thing and said, I bet he writes you from death row. And I'm like, there's no way he's going to write me from death row. He's written me a couple of letters. And in one of them, he thanks me and he says that he wishes we had met under different circumstances. So.
Yeah, crazy. Okay, there's more to talk about on that. So you interview him. Let's get back to this 13-hour interview. So you interview him. He basically, how do you get him to confess? Because he confesses.
So Mirandize him, read him his rights. He starts talking. And then at one point he says, yeah, you know what? I can't talk to you. And so I asked him, do you want to talk to somebody else? And he's like, I can't talk to anybody. And I'm like, okay. And, I'm disappointed. And we end the interview. End it. He needs to get processed by our forensic specialist. So I said, okay, we're going to have somebody come because I had a warrant to get his DNA, his fingerprints, his dental impressions. And so we're waiting for them to come. And I'm sitting in the room and I'm probably sitting there for, 15, 20 minutes waiting for them to come. And at one point he looks at me and I had offered him to go outside because it was cold in the room. And I said, hey, do you want to go outside? Would you rather talk outside? And so he looks at me and he goes, hey, you had offered me to go outside. Can we go outside now? And I'm like, yeah, sure. We're just waiting around anyway. So he's in a wheelchair and I wheel him outside. And as soon as I get him outside, he says, I'm going to be honest with you. I had an ulterior motive for bringing you out here. And I said, okay. He says, I will tell you everything you want to know as long as I get the death penalty.
He wants the death penalty.
Right. In my mind, I heard, as long as I don't get the death penalty. But I go, wait, what did you say? He goes, I'll tell you everything you want to know as long as you promise that I'll get the death penalty. And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, yeah, you deserve the death penalty. But I said,
You're like, I'll just pull out my gun and shoot you right now. Just tell me where the girls are and what you did to them first.
Exactly. So I said, I can't make that decision myself. I need to call the DA. So I call Larry Yellen, who's at a baseball field with his kids. And so I tell him, I'm like, hey, this is what we've got. And he's like, I'll be right down. He ends up having a conversation with Stephen Gordon, and the interview's back on. And remind him of his rights again, go through it. And for the first, we're now 7-8 hours into it. He's telling me what had happened, but he's refusing to involve Frank Cano. He's doing everything in his power to protect Frank. So he's accepting responsibility for everything. He murdered the girls. He kidnapped the girls. It was his idea. Yes, Frank Cano was there, but he's the one that did it all, which I know is bullshit. And so during this interview, he's trying to make deals with me. Everything's on his what he wants, on his terms. And I knew there had to come a point where I needed to flip the roles. And so I take a break, sitting there with Jeff Cunio, and I'm like, at one point he says, I will tell you where all the girls were discarded of, because I know you want to know that, if you let me see Frank Cano.
He wants to see his lover, Frank.
Yes. And then he promises to tell me which trash can he discarded the girls. And he knew that was important to me because I kept trying to skirt around and try to get to that question. And the reason I wanted to know is because if we could determine what trash dumpster they went in, the trash company would be able to tell me which landfill and what section of the landfill the girls ended up in so that we could potentially dig for their bodies. And that was the whole plan. So he knew that was something I wanted, and it was something that he kept from me. So he says he wants to see Frank Cano, and I'm like, what am I going to do? So Jeff Cunio and I are talking, and we're throwing out different ideas, try this, try that. And I'm like, no, I don't like that, blah, blah. And then suddenly Jeff Cunio goes, what about if you tell him that Frank doesn't want to see him? And I'm like, oh, that's going to crush him. Because in 45 minutes that I talked to Frank Cano, and in all the time I processed him, he never once asked for Stephen Gordon. I've now been in a room with Stephen Gordon, and all he could do was ask about Frank Cano. So I prepared myself to throw the biggest poker bluff I've ever thrown in my life, because I try not to lie during interviews. And so I went in and I told him, I said, hey, good news, Stephen. My administration will allow me to take you down and see Frank Gordon or Frank Cano. And he's like, okay, great. I said, but he doesn't want to see you. And he's like, that's a lie. I'm like, he doesn't want to see you. He's like, you're lying. I said, well, you said he didn't want to talk to me, and he talked to me. So why would I lie? He doesn't want to see you. And I could see his demeanor instantly change. He kind of curled into the blanket. He turned his body away from me. He had an empty can of a soda that he's pretending to take a sip from. And I let him sit in this silence and this heartbreak for the longest 2 agonizing minutes of my life, just waiting. And I knew at that moment that the control of the interview room had shifted. And he, after 2 long minutes, he turns to me and he says, do you have those pictures of those girls? I said, yeah. He goes, can you bring them? And I did. I brought them back in. And without being prompted, he put them all in order. And he proceeded to tell me, detail by detail, what he and Frank Cano had done to those women.
Wow. That technique, that tactic worked like a charm. Does he now know, does Stephen Gordon now know that you lied about Frank not?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Did he ever call you out on it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
We've had conversations since then. He's he defended himself.
Yeah. So, okay. So, because we'll get back to that. And God, I might need to have you on for another whole podcast to talk about this, because you and I went and talked to Stephen Gordon one day, and there is a crazy story there that I'm dying to tell. So this tactic, this technique of telling him about Frank Cano not wanting to see him, it worked.
Breaking his heart. I broke his heart.
You broke his heart. And it was then that he told you everything.
The control of the room shifted, and he not only told me everything that he had done to the women and what Frank had done, but he also told me that I was missing a girl. And that's when I learned about Jane Doe, that there was another victim that I didn't know about and that I now had to search for.
Oh, wow. The plot thickens and the story continues. We're out of time for today's podcast, but I got to hear the rest of this.
I'm sorry I've been yapping so
No,
much.
you've been great. Are you kidding? There's so much. Listen, we have, now 5 victims, and who knows how many more, realistically. That's what we know of. Who knows how many more there really are. But this has been fascinating, and I love hearing the story, and as tragic as it is, but I want to deep dive into this more. We're going to have you on the next episode. So we're out of time for today. So that's all you get to hear. You're going to have to tune in to the next episode of Defeating the Darkness if you want to find out what happens when Detective Julissa Trapp breaks down Stephen Gordon, turns the table during that interview, and he confesses to the murder of not 4, but 5 women that he and his lover, Frank Cano, committed. We'll see you next time. Until then, if you can't find the light, be the light.